It is June 2018, and here's the system still working fine. I think I jumped ahead a couple of years. So everything's been working great, and it's been running now for about 3.5 years, and there have been 0 breakdowns, not even one failure or problem. I took it online 3.5 years ago. I haven't paid an electric bill since, and actually get money back from the power company because I generate more than I use with this, with just this array. And as far as the self-cleaning, I don't do any cleaning on this. Everything washes off with the rain. Here in this lower corner, you can see there's a little residue that builds up just from pollen and dust that gets washed off, and it kind of pulls into this lower edge. It doesn't hurt a thing, and from a distance you can't notice it. In the spring, depending on when the pollen breaks out and if there's no rain, and it did happen this spring, you can get pollen that lands on this and it'll be like yellow, like it's painted yellow. And so the first time that happened, I thought, oh boy, that's gonna shut down power production. And I went to check the meter, and I came out, brought a garden hose out here, washed it off, and then went to check the power again, and I had about 5% more power. So it was interesting because even though it looked like it was painted yellow and it would be a big impact, really the vast majority of the sunlight was getting through and still producing electricity. And so, you know, a lot is being reflected, and that looks like a lot, but you know, really wasn't that much. Okay, so here's underneath. I had, you know, made it out of these poles, and these are just Schedule 40 galvanized pipe, and I did clean them with some solvent, and I spray painted them, but you can see, you know, it's hard to get that to stick on. You know, it's just hard to get that clean. Here's a major change. When I was originally doing this, I envisioned putting the inverters out here. So, you know, coming across the field is where we trenched in the service cable. So that was 3 2-gauge aluminum wires and a 4-gauge aluminum wire. And those come up through here. And so the plan was that I was gonna take my DC wires, hang up the 2 inverters here, generate 240 volts off each of those inverters, and then pump it back into this service wire. And then I got the idea that I would like to do a test to see if I could put the inverters inside and convert these service wires, these 4 service wires, into 2 DC loops, which seemed like a stretch because it's like 600 feet away, 500 to 600 feet away. So that's a long way to shoot the DC. And it's not that the DC is a problem, it's the signals that are transmitted through that wire that come from these DC to DC converters that SolarEdge uses. So I wasn't sure if that was even going to work, and I didn't think about the idea of doing it until after we had already trenched in this wire. But anyway, I did give it a go, and it worked great. So what I did is I took those 4 service wires and I made them into 2 DC loops. So the 2-gauge and the 2-gauge is one loop, and then the 2-gauge and the 4-gauge is the other loop that I use for the smaller. And I did ground this in, you know, got a grounding stake. That's definitely required by code. And then there's also a grounding stake that's driven in over at the entrance to the structure where the DC inverters are. But that does a couple of things, you know. So now I am transmitting the power from here to there at a higher DC voltage, so that's better because the amperage is lower and I got less losses. And then the main thing is that I don't have these inverters out here in a field, you know, with dirt daubers and spiders and everything else trying to make a home in it. So here's all my big bundle of DC wires coming in from, you know, the various groupings. For the 14.4 kilowatt inverter, it's 3 groups of 14 for a total of 42. And then for the 6 kilowatt inverter, it is 2 groups of 9 for a total of 18. So that's a total of 60. So they all come in here and they go into this conduit, and then inside this box they attach here to the DC loop, to the 2 DC loops, and then those go down and then over to the structure. So I'm carrying everything in DC, and even though it's 500 to 600 feet, all the signaling works great. The inverter is able to talk to these DC to DC converters without any trouble. I haven't had any trouble. I don't know how close to the edge I am, you know. Like if it was longer, would it still work? I don't know. But it works great. 500 to 600 feet. So, you know, I would do it differently if I was doing it from the beginning, but I didn't get the idea until I was already underway. But even so, it still works good. See, here's this board here. That's where I had originally attached the inverters. I did get the inverters set up out here. I got them running, you know, and I was pumping all the power in. And I passed all my inspections and everything, and I got everything done. And then it was after all that was done that I decided, all right, let's do a test and see if we can move it in. So that did work. I'm gonna shoot another piece of video because I got a question about how I connected all the wires together inside this junction box. So I've turned the array off and I've shut down the inverters, and I've watched the DC voltages descend to their safe tally voltages of 9 volts and 14 volts for the 2 inverters. So we'll take this cover off and look inside. Let's look underneath this box first. You can see here's the 3/4 inch flexible conduits coming into the bottom of the box. Now we'll look into the top here, and you can see the 2 on the right. Those are my incoming PV cables, a whole bunch of them. That's a total of 6 strings coming in. Correction, that's a total of 5 strings coming in. Those connect together. For the ground, I'm using split bolts. And for the power DC loops, I'm using mechanical connection blocks with a heavy-duty heat shrink overwrap. I connect the strings together into one DC loop, which then exits through this left side conduit and heads back toward the structure. Now, if you were paying attention, you might remember that I said that I was using direct burial 2-gauge aluminum to conduct the power back to the structure. There's 4 conductors. It's actually 2-gauge, 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 and 4-gauge. And those are coming in through this 1¼ inch rigid PVC conduit. So it would be curious if I could get those direct burial cables to fit inside this 3/4 inch flexible conduit, because those cables are way too thick to fit inside a 3/4 inch flexible conduit. But if, on the other hand, up inside this last run of 1¼ PVC, I had connected each of those aluminum cables to a 6-gauge THHN insulated copper wire using a mechanical splicing block with a heavy-duty heat shrink overlay, with each connection staggered about 10 inches apart so they would fit inside the pipe. That would pose a small problem because that wouldn't meet code, because mechanical connections need to be accessible, and inside this pipe they're clearly not. Nevertheless, I got the system to work. Another thing I did right after I got this thing operating, I put in 2 big lightning rods, because It's a lot of equipment out in the middle of a field. And I'm thinking, you know, it could get struck by lightning at any time. So this is just a pipe buried straight in the ground. There's no concrete footer there. I just dug a hole as deep as I could with a post hole digger. Put it down in there. Comes up. And then right there, it connects into, I think, like a 1/2 inch nipple of some sort that's 6 inches long. And then I got a copper grounding rod and soldered that in to the nipple. Just filled it up. And then that just sticks up in the air. And there's 2 of them. And, you know, does it work? Well, all I can say is that it hasn't been struck by lightning, as far as I know. Or if it has, I haven't seen any damage. But it does make me feel better. But I think the biggest thing to me that's neat is that this thing hasn't even flinched. You know, this thing came online 3.5 years ago. It belches out power, huge amounts of power. It's totally silent. It doesn't make any noise. You wouldn't think it's doing anything. And you know, it just generates ridiculous amounts of power. I can run water heaters, central air conditioners, pumps, water wells. You know, all the air conditioners can be on all at one time and the water heaters are going, and we're still exporting power if the sun is out. So, you know, if you're wasteful and you're taking a long shower and you're thinking, you know, maybe my karma's not feeling so good, it is nice to know that you're still exporting power to the grid. So you got that going for you. And that's nice. So we'll go check out the area where I've got the inverters now mounted. When I switched the run into the structure from AC to DC, I also had to change the cutoff box. So previously I'd hooked up something like this, which was a typical air conditioner pull-out switch, and that has pull-out blades and 2 fuses. But this is rated for AC and it doesn't have a DC rating. Plus the dimensional requirements for a DC fuse are different from the dimensional requirements of a similarly rated AC amperage fuse, because of the way the sparks occur in DC versus AC when the fuse breaks. So you have to switch over to a DC switch. Not difficult, and they're readily available and affordable and easy to put in, but it just has to be something with an appropriate DC rating. The other thing is that you know, originally this was probably too small anyway, because these are typically 60 amp fuses, and on my installation I'm importing a lot more than 60 amps. But of course at the higher voltages that would be coming in, closer to 400 volts DC instead of 240 AC, I wouldn't be flowing that many amps. But you still can't use this because the fuses don't have a DC rating. And if you do get proper fuses with a DC rating, they're much larger and wouldn't fit in this box, so you have to do something different. By far the easiest solution is just to get a DC cutoff switch. Here's the 2 inverters now, which are mounted inside. This is a much better solution than having them outside in the field. You know, it's just cutting grass out there, and it's just a really neat idea to know that these are inside, away from the dust and out of the weather. And, you know, it's just generally a nicer situation. These are in a NEMA 3R, I think, enclosure. So they're of course rated for outdoors. They could be out in the open, but you know, if you have an opportunity to put them inside, I just think that's an awesome solution. So so there's a junction box coming in. That's my DC coming in, and then I've got the AC coming out, and it just kind of runs over. I've got open cables there going into the box. In a later video, I've got these. This is an old leftover part of the 240 feed that I use. This is the underground direct burial, that we did back in part 1. I had a bunch left over, and I've run that to another location because I'm going to add some more panels to these inverters at some point, to just try to run these closer to the limit at some point. So anyway, that comes a little bit later. And let's look at them. Let's see what we got. This is the 6,000 watt inverter. It's a little later in the day. It's doing about 3,300. And this is the 11.4 inverter, which is doing just short of 8,000 watts. So I came out here in March of this year. It was kind of a cold, really clear day. And I saw these inverters running more power than I've ever seen before. This one was running at about 12,200 watts, which I didn't even think it would do. This is an 11.4 kilowatt inverter. I didn't think it would go above that. This is a 6 kilowatt inverter, and I know that this one will not go above 6 kilowatts, more than just a few watts. And if you have more solar panel power supplied than 6,000 watts, it'll adjust the MPP to keep it, floating right at 6,000. It'll just bounce around right there, kind of reducing the efficiency of the solar panels. So I thought that the same would happen with this 11.4 one. Now this one has, it's a different design. It's got active cooling fans in it, whereas this one's all passive. So I can touch these aluminum panels right now, and they're warm. Because it's got about 1% losses, and then there's hot air coming off the top. And this one has active cooling fans, and this one's just passive convection. So I didn't know that this one would go higher than 11.4, but it was up to 12.2, 12,200 watts. So that was really surprising. I don't know what happens on this one, to limit it. I don't know if it gets hot, it starts to shut it down. So anyway, if anybody has any experience on, what happens when you overload this one, it'd be neat to know. I know what happens on this one because I have another installation where I have 30 solar panels connected to a 6,000 watt inverter, and it overloads quite frequently. And like I said, it just adjusts the MPP down, the maximum power production point. It skews the voltages and the currents to decrease the efficiency of the panel so that it floats right at 6,000. So anyway, that happened because it was a cold, clear day. The solar panels work better when they're cold, and the sun was right in the right area, and it was just an absolutely brilliant, clear, blue sky day. And the 42 solar panels that were connected to this inverter, were really just pumping the juice out. So anyway, that was something. So with this one doing, 12.2, and this one doing right about 6,000, I was producing over 18,000 watts of power. It's crazy, crazy. That's huge. So if we come over here to this circuit breaker box, I'm feeding the big inverter into a 50 amp circuit breaker and the small one into a 30, and then my main down here, this is a sub panel, and my main is 100 amps. Now the wire's rated for 100 amps, but I just use a 60 in the main because you can put a circuit breaker on a wire that's less than the wire rating. You just can't go more. And I did not envision that I would ever have a problem with 60 amps, but I was producing so much power off this inverter that I popped the 60 amp breaker and it shut the system down. So I had to go replace the 60 amp breaker with a 100 amp breaker. And I never imagined that I would have a problem producing, that I was producing more than 60 amps at 240. But you do the math and sure, yeah, absolutely. You pop up there around 72 amps or so. You know, that's more than 60 for sure. But that's a neat problem to have when you have to increase the size of your circuit breaker because of all the power you're producing. Super cool. Anyway, there you go.